Welcome to Audiorama Onda Lectora. Make yourself comfortable, listen, and enjoy to Unlocking the Mysteries. The Hidden Secrets of Metaphysics by Emmet Fox, Audiobook Edition.
The Hidden Secrets of Metaphysics. Emmet Fox. What are the lessons Jesus taught us? Jesus Christ is, without a doubt, the most transcendental figure in the history of mankind. No matter the perspective from which one examines him, his relevance is undeniable, and he deserves unanimous recognition. This statement is valid, regardless of whether he is considered a divinity, as if he is conceived as a human being. If we consider him in his human facet, whether as the most eminent prophet and global educator, or simply as a passionate enthusiast with good intentions. He saw his path marked by suffering, failure and desolation, after a brief but tumultuous public exposure. Regardless of how he is perceived, the fact remains that the life and death of Jesus, as well as the teachings attributed to him, had more influence on mankind than those of any other man who ever lived. More than Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, Napoleon, or Washington. His doctrines, or at least those attributed to him today, have had a greater impact on the lives of more people. More books are written, read, and bought about him. More speeches, let's call them sermons, are delivered than about all the other men mentioned together. The fact of having been the religious inspiration of the entire European race throughout the 2 millennia, in which that race has dominated and shaped the destiny of the whole world, both culturally, socially and politically. As well as in the period in which the entire surface of the earth was finally discovered and occupied, and in its broad contours shaped by civilization, by itself alone gives it the right to the first position worldwide. And therefore, there can be no more important undertaking than to inquire into the question of what Jesus really stood for. What did Jesus teach us? What does he really want us to believe and do? What goals did he have in his heart? And to what extent did he succeed in achieving those goals, in his life and death? To what extent did the religion or movement called Christianity, over the last 19 centuries, really express or represent his ideas? To what extent does Christianity today communicate his message to the world? If he were to return now, what would he think of the self-styled Christian nations in general, as well as the Christian churches in particular? The Anglicans, Baptists, Catholics, Greek Orthodox, Methodists, Presbyterians, Quatrists, Salvationists, Seventh-day Adventists, or Unitarians. What was the teaching that Jesus imparted to us? This is the question I have set out to answer throughout this book. I propose to show that the message that Jesus brought has a unique and special value. For it is the truth, as well as the only perfect statement, of the truth of the nature of God and of man, of life and of the world, as well as of the relationships that exist between them. Moreover, we will discover that its teachings are not a mere abstract account of the universe, which would only be of academic interest. On the contrary, they constitute a practical method for the development of the soul, as well as for the shaping of our lives and destinies, into the things we really want them to be. Jesus explains to us what the nature of God is, and what our own nature is. He explains to us the meaning of life and death. He teaches us why we make mistakes, why we yield to temptation, or why we become sick, impoverished and old. More importantly, it tells us how all these evils can be overcome, and how we can bring health, happiness and true prosperity to our lives and the lives of others, if we really want it. Having said the above, we can now emphasize that the first aspect to understand is a fact of fundamental importance, as it means to depart from all the ordinary prepositions of orthodoxy. The fact to be emphasized is that Jesus did not teach any theology. The teaching of Jesus is entirely spiritual or metaphysical. Unfortunately, historical Christianity has been largely concerned with theological and doctrinal issues that, oddly enough, play no role in the teaching of the gospel. It will surprise many good people to know that all the doctrines and theologies of the churches are human inventions, elaborated by their authors from their own biases, and imposed on the Bible from the outside. Nevertheless, this reality persists. In truth, there is absolutely no theological system or doctrine to be found in the pages of the Bible. They are simply human constructions. Virtuous people who felt the need for an intellectual explanation of life, and who also held the belief that the Bible was a divine revelation. These people came to the logical conclusion that one thing must be inside the other. More or less unconsciously, they sought to fabricate the thing they wished to find. They did not have the spiritual or metaphysical key. Indeed, they were not in what is called the spiritual basis, and therefore, they were looking for an explanation, purely intellectual or three-dimensional explanation of life. And it is not possible for such an explanation to exist. The fact that man possesses an essentially spiritual and eternal life is the real explanation of his life. This world and the life which we intellectually know are, so to speak, but a cross-section of the whole truth concerning him. Whereas a cross-section of anything, from a machine to a horse, can never provide even a partial explanation of the whole. This perspective only glimpses a small corner of the universe, and that even with eyes half open, and starting from a point of view exclusively centered on humanity and the earth. The human being built fables as extravagant as disturbing, about an unlimited God with human form. The one who directed his universe, in a similar way, to how an ignorant and rudimentary prince could manage the affairs of a small oriental kingdom. To this being, all kinds of human weaknesses were imputed, such as vanity, inconstancy, and rancor. Later, a far-fetched and very incongruous legend was constructed, about original sin, about vicarious blood atonement, about infinite punishment for finite transgressions. And in certain cases, an unspeakably dreadful doctrine was added, about predestination to eternal torment, or eternal bliss. However, this theory was never taught in the Bible. If the purpose of the Bible were to teach it, it would be perfectly set forth in some chapter, but it is not. The plan of salvation, so prominent in evangelical sermons, and in the divinity books of an earlier generation, is absent in the Bible. No such agreement ever existed in the universe, and the Bible does not teach it at all. And instead, certain obscure texts from Genesis, some phrases taken at random from Paul's letters, as well as one or two isolated verses from other parts of the scriptures, could be extracted and joined together by theologians. All in order to produce the kind of teaching which in their view should be in the Bible. Jesus, on the other hand, knows nothing of all this. He is far from being a Pollyanna, as they say, or any optimist. He warns us not once, but many times, that obstinacy in sin brings with it a very severe punishment. Just as it happens with the man who separates himself from the integrity of his soul. Even if he were to gain the whole world, he would be a tragic fool. However, it teaches that the punishments are a real and direct consequence of our sins. And it shows us that any individual, no matter how permeated with wickedness and impurity, always has direct access to an almighty and loving God the Father, who will forgive him, and provide him with his own strength, which will allow him to find himself again, and up to 70 times 7, if necessary. Bible 13:5. Jesus has been sadly misunderstood and misrepresented, in other directions. Thus, for example, there is no justification of any kind in his teachings, for the establishment of any form of ecclesiastical, or any hierarchy of officials or ritual system. He approved of none of that, and in fact, his mentality is definitely contrary to the ecclesiastical. For the duration of his public life, he was at war with the ecclesiastics and other religious officials of his own country. They hindered him at first, and then persecuted him, owing to a perfectly sound instinct of self-preservation. They felt instinctively that the truth, in the way he taught it, constituted the beginning of the end for them, so they finally killed him. Their claims to authority as representatives of God, he ignored them entirely, and for their ritual and ceremonies, he showed only impatience and contempt. Human nature seems to be very prone to believe what it wants to believe, rather than undertake the work of really searching the scriptures with an open mind. For example, perfectly sincere men have called themselves Christian leaders, and have clothed themselves with the most imposing and pretentious titles, the better to impress people. In spite of the fact that their teacher, in the plainest language, strictly commanded his followers that they were to do nothing of the kind. But do not pretend to be called Rabbi, for one is your Master, the Christ, and you are all brethren. Matthew 23:8. Furthermore, he denounced the Pharisees as hypocrites, because they love the chief seats and bind heavy burdens, difficult to carry, with all kinds of rules and regulations, as we shall see later. Jesus did not ask for the fulfillment of strict norms or rules. What he insisted on was that a certain spirit prevail in one's conduct, seeking to teach only principles. Aware that when the spirit is right, the details are aligned to this, and that in fact, the letter kills but the spirit enlivens, as sadly could be observed in the actions of the Pharisees. In spite of this, Orthodox Christianity has tried at all costs to impose on the people all kinds of strict rules or regulations. A striking case that illustrates this is the Puritan attempt to impose the Old Testament Sabbath on Christians, although this was a purely Hebrew ordinance. Even so, fierce punishments were given to those who broke it, in spite of the fact that Jesus discouraged the superstitious command of the Sabbath, saying that the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. He clearly indicated throughout his teachings that the time has come for man to make each and every day a spiritual Sabbath, acting at all times in a spiritual context. It is obvious that if the Hebrew Sabbath was obligatory for Christians, then now that they rest on Sunday, they are still incurring in all the faults of Sabbath breaking. There are many modern Christians who realize that there is no system of theology in the Bible, unless one wants to put it there deliberately. And they have practically abandoned theology altogether, but still cling to Christianity, because they feel intuitively that it is the truth. In reality, there is no logical justification for their attitude, since they do not possess the spiritual key, which makes the teaching of Jesus intelligible. Therefore, they strive to rationalize their attitude in various ways. This is the dilemma of man, who has neither the blind faith of orthodoxy, nor the spiritual interpretation of scientific Christianity, with which to sustain himself. He has no sustenance to lean on, other than that of old-fashioned Unitarianism, and if he does not reject miracles altogether, he is at least very uncomfortable with them. They embarrass him, and he wishes they were not in the Bible, and would be glad in his heart to be rid of them. A Life of Jesus, just published by a well-known clergyman, clearly illustrates how false this position is. The author admits in this book that Jesus may have healed some people, or helped them to heal themselves, but he draws the line at this point. The other miracles, he explains them as if they did not exist. According to him, these are the usual fantastic legends, which revolve around all the great historical figures. Thus, as an example, we can remember what happened at the lake, where the disciples were very frightened, but thought of Jesus, and that thought calmed their fears. Later, they exaggerated in an absurd story, that he had come to them in person, walking on the water. Apparently, on another occasion, he reformed a sinner by bringing him out of the tomb of sin, and this was expanded years and years later, into a ridiculous legend, that he had actually revived a dead man. Again, Jesus prayed fervently one night, so that he was seen beaming with happiness. And Peter, who had fallen asleep, woke up startled, and years later told a confusing story, about believing that he had seen Moses there. And so was the Transfiguration, and so on to this day. Now, one must extend all sympathy and special pleas, to a man captivated by the beauty and mystery of the Gospels. However, in the absence of the spiritual key, he considers that his common sense, and all the scientific knowledge of mankind, are mocked by much of what is contained in these Gospels. But this is simply not possible. The rest of the gospel account loses its meaning entirely, if the miracles never took place, if Jesus never believed in their possibility, nor undertook to perform them. It is not truthful to assert that he only presented them occasionally, and in fact, he exhibited them constantly and repeatedly. And if he did not believe, and taught many things in frank contradiction, with the rationalistic philosophy of the 18th and 19th century, the gospel account is chaotic, contradictory, and devoid of all meaning. We cannot get out of the dilemma by saying that Jesus was not interested in the beliefs and superstitions of his time, and that he took them more or less for granted, because what really interested him was character. All this is a weak argument, for character must include an intelligent and vital reaction to life, and this includes some definite beliefs and convictions about the things that really matter. However, miracles did happen, all the works recounted of Jesus in the 4 Gospels did happen, and many others as well, which, if each were written, I believe would not fit the breadth of the earth. Jesus himself justified what people considered a strange and wonderful teaching by the works he was able to do. And he went further, and said in reference to those who study and practice his teaching, "The works that I do, you will do, and even greater." Now, and after all, what do we call a miracle? Those who deny the possibility of miracles, on the grounds that the universe is a perfect system of law and order, in the operation of which there can be no exceptions, are absolutely right. The explanation for this is that the world we normally know, and whose laws are techniques known to most people, is only a fragment of the whole universe, as it is in reality. Therefore, there is the appeal from a lower law to a higher one, from a lower expression to a higher one. However, the appeal of the lower law to the higher is not really a violation of the law, for the possibility of such an appeal is part of the main constitution of the universe. Therefore, in the sense of a true violation of the law, miracles are impossible. But in the sense that all the ordinary rules and limitations of the physical plane can be set aside and overruled by an understanding which has risen above them. Miracles, in the colloquial sense of the word, can and do occur. Let us imagine, in order to give an example, that on any given Monday, your affairs are in such a state that humanly speaking it is certain that certain consequences will occur before the end of the week. However, these may be legal consequences, perhaps of a very unpleasant nature, following some decision of the courts, or they may be certain physical consequences, on the human body. It is possible that a competent doctor may decide that a dangerous operation is absolutely necessary, and even consider it his responsibility to say that there is no chance of the patient to recover. But if someone can raise his consciousness above the limitations of the physical plane in relation to the matter, and this is only a scientific description, what is commonly called prayer, then the conditions on that plane would change. In some totally unexpected and normally impossible way, the legal adversity could dissipate. And to the benefit of all parties involved in the matter, the patient might recover, without undergoing the operation, or might find relief, instead of facing a fatal outcome. In other words, so-called miracles, in the common sense of the word, can and do happen as a result of prayer. Prayer changes things. Praying makes things happen very differently from how they would have happened if prayer had not been said. It makes no difference what kind of difficulty you have. No matter what causes have led you to it, it is enough to pray your way out of your problem, if you are persistent enough in your appeal to God. Moreover, prayer is a science and an art, and it was to the teaching of this science and this art that Jesus devoted most of his ministry. If the miracles of the gospel occurred, it is because Jesus understood the spiritual world, which gave greater power to his prayer than to that of anyone else either before or after him. It is necessary to take into account another interpretation of the Gospels. Tolstoy forced himself in presenting the Sermon on the Mount as a practical guide for life, considering its precepts literally at face value, and ignoring the spiritual interpretation, of which he was not aware, as well as excluding the plane of the Spirit, in which he did not believe. By discarding the whole Bible except the 4 Gospels, and discarding all miracles, he made a heroic but futile attempt to combine Christianity in materialism. And of course, he failed. His real place in history does not lie in being the founder of a new religious movement, but in being the man whose practical anarchism, driven by genius, paved the way for the Bolshevik Revolution. Similar to how Joshua had prepared the ground for the French Revolution. It is the spiritual key that unlocks the mystery of biblical teaching in general, and of the Gospels in particular. It is the spiritual key that explains the miracles, and shows that they were performed to demonstrate to us that we too can work miracles, and thus overcome sin, sickness, and limitation. Thanks to this key, we can afford to emphasize verbal inspiration, and all superstitious literalism, and yet understand that the Bible is really the most precious and authentic possession of all those of man. Looking at it from the outside, the Bible is a collection of inspired documents, written by men of all kinds, in all kinds of circumstances, and over hundreds of years. These documents, as we have them, are almost never original, as they are redactions and compilations of ancient fragments, and the names of the actual writers are seldom known with certainty. However, this does not affect in the least the spiritual purpose of the Bible. And in fact, it is quite irrelevant. The book as it stands is an inexhaustible reservoir of spiritual truth, compiled under divine inspiration. And the actual route by which it arrived at its present form is not important. The name of the author of a specific chapter is as insignificant as the name of its scribe, if the author were to be mentioned. What really matters is the divine wisdom, and that is what concerns us. The so-called higher criticism focuses only on the external, leaving aside completely the spiritual content of the scriptures. And from the spiritual point of view, history is not important. Biography, lyric, and other poetic forms are various means by which the spiritual message is given in the Bible. Parables are used to convey spiritual and metaphysical truth. Many times, what was never intended to be more than a parable was taken at the time as a literal statement of fact, which often made the Bible appear to teach things that are contrary to common sense. An example is the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. If understood correctly, it is perhaps the most wonderful parable of all. Its author never intended it to be taken for history, but literal-minded people took it that way, with all sorts of absurd consequences. The spiritual key of the Bible saves us from all these difficulties, dilemmas, and apparent inconsistencies. It saves us from the false positions of ritualism, evangelicalism, and so-called liberalism alike, because it gives us the truth. This truth turns out to be nothing less than the amazing but undeniable fact that the whole external world, be it the physical body, the common things of life, the winds, the rain, the clouds, the earth itself, lends itself to the thought of man, and that he has dominion over it, when he knows it. The outer world, far from being the prison of circumstances, which it is commonly supposed to be, in reality, has no character of its own, neither good nor bad. It has only the character that we attribute to it, consciously or unconsciously. On a day-to-day basis, all the thoughts that occupy your mind, secret tulyagar as Jesus calls it, are shaping your destiny, for better or for worse. In fact, to tell the truth, the whole experience of our life is nothing more than the outward expression of inner thought. Now, we can choose the kind of thoughts we harbor. It will be a little difficult to break a bad thinking habit, but it can be done. In fact, we always choose, and therefore, our lives are the result of the kind of thoughts we have chosen to have. So they are of our own order, and hence, there is perfect justice in the universe. We do not suffer for another man's original sin, but we reap what we ourselves have sown. We have free will, but our free will lies in our choice of thought. This is, in essence, what Jesus taught. It is, as we shall see, the underlying message of the whole Bible, although it is not expressed with the same clarity throughout the book. At the beginning of the book, it shines faintly, like the light of a heavily lighted lamp. But as time goes on, one veil after another is removed, and the light shines brighter and brighter. Until in the teaching of Jesus Christ, it shines clear and unobstructed on this plane. What we have to address is man's understanding of the truth, and throughout history, this has been steadily and continuously refined. In fact, what we call progress is but the outward expression, corresponding to the idea of God, in which mankind continually improves. Jesus Christ summarized this truth, taught it fully and thoroughly, and above all, demonstrated it in his own person. At present, most of us can glimpse intellectually the idea of what it must mean in its fullness, and much more of what it must inevitably derive from a competent understanding of it. However, all that we can demonstrate is a very different matter. Acceptance of the truth is the great first step, but we shall not have taken it until we demonstrate it in practice. Jesus demonstrated all that he taught, including the overcoming of death, in what we call resurrection. For reasons I cannot discuss here, it happens that every time you overcome a difficulty by prayer, you help the whole human race, past, present and future, in a general way. And it is helped to overcome that special kind of difficulty, in particular. Jesus, by overcoming all kinds of limitations, to which mankind is subject, and in particular by overcoming death, performed a work of unique and incalculable value to the race. For this reason, he is justly entitled, as the Savior of the world. When he considered that the time was ripe, he set out to summarize all that he had achieved, in a series of lectures that extended probably, for several days. In these lectures, he spoke probably 2 or 3 times a day. He took this opportunity to summarize the message, and dotted the I's and crossed the T's, so to speak. Naturally, some of those present took notes, and later, these notes were edited into what we know as the Sermon on the Mount. The authors of the 4 Gospels, each one selected the material for his monograph, according to his own purpose. It is Matthew who gives us the most complete and carefully ordered version of the discourse. The Sermon on the Mount is an almost perfect codification of the religion of Jesus Christ, and that is why I have chosen it as the text for this book. It is practical and personal, it is definitive, specific, and yet, amply enlightening. Once the true meaning of the instructions is grasped, it is only necessary to begin to faithfully put them into practice, to obtain immediate results. The degree and magnitude of these results will depend solely on the sincerity and thoroughness with which they are applied. This is a question which each individual must solve for himself. No one can save his brother's soul, nor pay his brother's debt. One can and should help others on special occasions, but in the long run, everyone must learn to do his own work, and sin no more, lest something worse happen to him. Now, if you really want to change your life, if you really want to become a totally different person in the eyes of God and men, if you really want health, peace of mind and spiritual development, then Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, has clearly shown you how to do it. But this is not an easy task, and although we know that it can be done, because there are those who have done it, it is necessary to pay a price. And the price is the actual application of these principles, in every corner of your life, as well as in every daily transaction, whether you want to do it or not, but especially where you would prefer not to. If you are prepared to pay that price, to really and truly break away from the old man, and begin to create the new, then the study of the great sermon will be for you the mountain of deliverance. Seeing the crowds, he went up a mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and taking the word, he began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they persecute you for my sake, and speak all kinds of evil against you, lying. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets, who were before you. The Sermon on the Mount begins with these 8 Beatitudes. It is, of course, one of the best-known sections of the Bible. Even people whose knowledge of the Scriptures is limited to half a dozen of the best-known chapters are probably familiar with the Beatitudes. Unfortunately, they hardly ever understand them, and usually consider them to be a counsel of perfection, with no real application to daily life. But this is only because they lack the spiritual key. The Beatitudes are actually a prose poem of 8 verses, which is complete in itself, and is practically a general summary of all Christian teaching. It is a spiritual rather than a literary summary, summarizing the spirit of the teaching rather than the letter. Such a general summary is highly characteristic of the ancient Eastern way of approaching a religious and philosophical teaching. It is naturally reminiscent of the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, the 10 Commandments of Moses, and other compact groupings of ideas. Jesus devoted himself exclusively to the teaching of general principles, and these general principles always had to do with mental states. He knew that if someone's mental states are correct, everything else must also be correct. Whereas if they are wrong, nothing else can be right. Contrary to the great religious teachers, he does not give us detailed instructions about what we should or should not do. It does not tell us to abstain from eating or drinking certain things, or to perform various religious rites at certain times and seasons. And in fact, the whole current of his teaching is anti-ritualistic and anti-formalist. At no time did he show sympathy for the Jewish priesthood and its theory of salvation through the fulfillment of certain rules. The hour is coming when you will not worship the Father, neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, he said. The hour is coming, and now is when the true worshipper will worship the Father, in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeks those who worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship him, in spirit and in truth. The Pharisees, because of their strict set of detailed rules, were the group to which he showed real intolerance. From their perspective, every Pharisee was extremely meticulous, and had to comply with numerous external details on a daily basis, before they felt they had complied with God's demands. According to a modern rabbi, the number of such details is not less than 600. And since it is evident that no human being could actually carry out such things in practice, the natural result would be that the victim, being aware of being far short of fulfilling his duties, would necessarily have to labor under a chronic feeling of sin. To consider oneself a sinner is, for all practical purposes, to be a sinner, with all the consequences that flow from that condition. However, Jesus' policy contrasts with this. For his aim is to strip the heart of all confidence in external things, both for pleasurable glorification and for spiritual salvation, and to incite a new attitude of mind. This policy is graphically set forth in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Here we must bear in mind a point of great practical importance in the study of the Bible. Namely, that the terms and expressions, and sometimes the words themselves, are used in the Bible in a sense which is clearly different from everyday usage. In reality, the Bible is a book of metaphysics, a manual for the growth of the soul, and contemplates all questions from this point of view. It is not possible to insist too much on this, so it adopts the broadest point of view, on all subjects. Contemplating all things, in their relation to the human soul, and employing many common terms, in a much wider sense than common usage gives them. For example, the word bread, in the Bible does not mean simply any kind of physical food, which is the broader interpretation, which is given to it in the general literature. Rather, it means all things that man needs, all physical things such as clothing, housing, money, education, companionship, and so on. And above all, it represents spiritual things, such as spiritual perception, spiritual understanding, and preeminently spiritual realization. Give us this day our daily bread. I am the bread of life. Another example is the word prosperity. In the biblical sense, prosper means much more than the acquisition of material possessions. In reality, it means success in prayer. Success in prayer is, from the soul's point of view, the only kind of prosperity worth having. Moreover, if our prayers are successful, we will naturally obtain all the material things we need. But material wealth is really the least important thing in life, and this is implied in the Bible, by giving the word prosperous its true meaning. The fact of being poor in spirit does not mean at all what today we call poor in spirit. Poverty of spirit means to have stripped oneself of all desire to exercise one's personal will. And what is equally important, to have renounced all preconceived opinions, in the sincere search for God. This means being willing, if necessary, to set aside your present way of thinking, your present views and prejudices, your present way of life. In fact, to discard everything that might stand in your way of finding God. One of the saddest passages in all literature is the story of the rich young man who lost a great opportunity to be happy and instead only had great possessions left. This is the story of humanity. In broad strokes, we reject the salvation that Jesus offers us, our chance to find God, because we only seek great possessions. Not in the least because we are rich, in terms of money, because in fact, most people are not, but because we have great possessions, forms of preconceived ideas, confidence in our own judgment, and ideas with which we happen to be familiar. Spiritual pride born of academic distinction, sentimental or material attachment, to institutions and organizations. Habits of life we do not wish to give up, concern for human respect, or perhaps fear of public ridicule. In short, an interest in worldly honor and distinction. These kinds of possessions keep us chained to the rock of suffering, which is our exile from God. The rich young man is one of the most tragic characters in history. Not because he was rich, for wealth in itself is neither good nor bad, but because his heart was enslaved by the love of money, which Paul tells us is the root of all evil. He might have been a multimillionaire in silver and gold, and so long as his heart was not bent upon it, he would have been as free as the poorest beggar, to enter into the kingdom of heaven. However, his confidence was in his riches, and this shut him out. For the message of Christ was not received with acclamation by the ecclesiastics of Jerusalem, because they had great possessions. Possessions of rabbinical learning, possessions of honor and public importance, positions of authority, as official teachers of religion. And these possessions would have had to be sacrificed to accept the spiritual teaching. The humble and unlettered, who listened to the teacher with pleasure, were happy not to have such possessions, which ostentatiously distanced them from the truth. Why in modern times, when the same simple message of Christ, about the immanence and availability of God, as well as about the inner light, which burns forever in the soul of man, was again his appearance in the world, was again gladly received, mostly only among the simple and unlettered? Why was it not the bishops, the deans, the ministers, and the Presbyterians, who made it known to the world? Why was not Oxford, or Cambridge, or Harvard, or Heidelberg, the great seat of diffusion of this most important knowledge? Again, the answer is because they had great possessions of intellectual and spiritual pride, great possessions of self-satisfaction and security, great possessions of academic commitment and social prestige. In contrast, the poor in spirit suffer none of these embarrassments, either because they have never had them, or because they have risen above them, in the tide of spiritual understanding. They are no longer intimidated by human authority, however august. No longer secure in their own opinions, they have realized that their most cherished beliefs may have been and probably were erroneous beliefs. And that all their ideas and views on life may be false and need to be recast. They are ready to start over from the beginning, and learn life anew. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Mourning, sadness, is not a good thing in itself, for of God's will, it is that all experience happiness and joyful success. Jesus says, I have come that they may have life, and that they may have it more abundantly. However, many times problems and suffering are extremely useful, because many people do not bother to learn the truth, until they are pushed to do so by pain and failure. Then, pain becomes a relatively good thing. Sooner or later, every human being will have to discover the truth of God, and make his own first-hand contact with it. We have to know the truth, which will free us once and for all, from our three-dimensional limitations and their concomitants, sin, sickness and death. But most people will not undertake the search for God wholeheartedly, unless they are driven to it by some kind of problem. In reality, there is no need for man to have problems, because if he only seeks God first, the problems never have to come. One can always choose between learning through spiritual development or learning through painful experience, and it will be his fault if he chooses the latter option. As a rule, only when health is broken and ordinary medical means have failed to provide relief. It is when people get serious about gaining that spiritual understanding of the body as the true embodiment of divine life, which is our only guarantee of overcoming illness and ultimately death. But if people would approach God and gain some of this understanding while their health is still good, they would never have to be sick again. Usually, only when people feel the pinch of poverty very acutely. That is, when ordinary material sources of supply have been exhausted, they turn to God as a last resort, and learn the lesson that divine power is truly the source of man's supply. And that all material agents are but the channels. But this lesson has to be thoroughly learned and realized, before man can pass on to any higher or wider experience than the present one. There are many mansions in our Father's house, but the key to higher mansions is always the acquisition of absolute mastery over the one in which we find ourselves. It is therefore a great blessing that we are forced to straighten ourselves out in the matter of supply. At the earliest possible time, prosperous people, if they recognize God as their true source, praying for a greater spiritual understanding on this point, will never have to suffer poverty or financial problems. Simultaneously, they should be careful to use their present resources well, not hoarding wealth selfishly, but knowing that God is the owner, as well as that they are only the stewards or trustees of it. The dominion of money implies a responsibility which cannot be shirked. You have to manage it wisely, or assume the consequences. This general premise has been implanted in each of our difficulties, not only in physical or financial problems, but in all other evils, of which the flesh is heir. Such as family difficulties, quarrels, estrangements, sin and remorse, and all the rest. They need not come at all, if we seek first the kingdom of God and right understanding, and if we do not, then they must come. For us, this morning will be a blessing in disguise, because through it, we will be comforted. And when the Bible speaks of consolation, it refers to the experience of the presence of God, which is the end of all mourning. The Orthodox churches have too often taught a crucified Christ, who ends on the cross. But the Bible presents us with the risen and triumphant Christ. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. On the face of it, this beatitude seems to have very little meaning, and even seems to be in contradiction with the facts of everyday life. Any reasonable individual, observing the world or studying history, could sincerely accept these words, at their surface value. Even many Christians, if they are the ones we are considering, have overlooked this teaching in practice, with a regrettable feeling that it should be so, although it certainly is not. However, this attitude is not enough. Sooner rather than later, the soul reaches a point, where evasions and sophistry have to be discarded once and for all, to face the reality of life, whatever it takes. So, either Jesus meant what he said, or he did not mean it, either he understood what he was saying, or he did not understand it. If we do not take these words seriously, we are faced with the position, which no Christian would want to adopt, namely, that Jesus expressed something he did not truly believe in, as those lacking integrity do. We have to face this situation from the beginning of our study of this Sermon on the Mount. We have two options, to take Jesus seriously, or not to take him seriously. And in which case, we would have to set aside his teachings, and stop calling ourselves Christians, defending his name with lip service. To say that Christianity is the divinely inspired truth, presuming to be Christian, and then to evade in practice all the definitive implications of his teaching. It is a most fatal hypocrisy and weakness. Either Jesus is a reliable guide, or he is not. If he is to be trusted, then let us assume that he meant what he said, and that he was the one who knew best about the art of living through the difficulties and pain which mankind suffers. They are really due to the very fact that our way of life is so opposed to the truth, that the things he taught and the things he said, seem to us at first glance, foolish and insane. The truth is, when the teachings of Jesus are correctly understood, they are not only true, but they are extremely practicable. Indeed, they are the most practicable of all doctrines. Thus we discover that he was not a sentimental dreamer, nor a mere merchant of empty platitudes, but the unwavering realist, which can only be a great mystic. In this text, summarizes the whole essence of his teaching, in terms of its practical application. This beatitude is among the half-dozen most important verses in the Bible. When you possess the spiritual meaning of this text, you will have the secret of mastery, the secret to overcome any kind of difficulty. It is literally the key to life, it is the message of Jesus Christ, reduced to a single phrase. This gnomic saying is actually the philosopher's stone of the alchemists, which converts the base metal of limitation and problems into the gold of comfort, or true harmony. We may notice that there are two polar words in the text, meek and earth. Both are used in a special and very technical sense, and it is necessary to unveil them, before finding the wonderful meaning, which underlies them. First of all, the word earth, in the Bible does not mean simply, this terrestrial globe, but it means manifestation. Manifestation or expression, is the result of a cause. Before we can know anything about a cause, it must be expressed or manifested. And conversely, every expression or manifestation must have a cause. Now, you learn in the divine metaphysics, and particularly in the Sermon on the Mount, that all chance is mental. And that your body and your affairs, your home, your business, your whole experience are but the manifestation of your own mental states. It does not matter that you are totally unconscious of most of your mental states, because they are there, even though you have now forgotten them, or have never been aware of them. In other words, your land means the whole of your outer experience, and inheriting the land means having dominion over that outer experience. That is, to have power to bring your living conditions into harmony and true success. The whole earth shall be filled with the glory of the Lord, his soul shall dwell in quietness, and his seed, which is prayers, shall inherit the earth. The Lord reigneth, let the earth rejoice. So we see that when the Bible speaks of possessing the earth, ruling the earth, making the earth glorious, and so on, it is referring to the conditions of our life, from our bodily health, to the furthest point of our affairs. Thus, this text undertakes to tell us how we can own or rule, to be masters of our own lives and destinies. Next, let us see how it is to be done. The Beatitude says that dominion, that is to say, power over the conditions of our life, must be obtained in a certain way, and in the most unexpected of all, nothing more and nothing less, than by meekness. However, the fact is that this word, meekness, is also used in a special and technical sense. Its real meaning has nothing in common with the meaning it now has in modern Spanish. To tell the truth, there are few qualities of human nature more unpleasant than that which today is denoted by the word meekness. To the modern reader, meekness suggests a mean-spirited creature, devoid of both worth and self-esteem, of no use to himself or anyone else, crawling about the face of the earth like a worm. It makes one think of Dickens' sycophant, at worst, as well as one of the moral wreckage of the same author. But tell him that he always has these characters, to warn or ridicule, and never to emulate them. The modern reader, with these connotations of the word in mind, comes to the Sermon on the Mount, which rejects the teachings it provides. Here, on the threshold, he is told that dominion is for the meek, and that doctrine he cannot accept. The true meaning of the word meek in the Bible is an attitude of mind, which combines faith in God and the understanding that God's will for us is always joyful and vital, and far better than anything we could wish for ourselves. This state of mind also includes a perfect willingness to allow this will of God to come about in the way that divine wisdom deems best, rather than some particular way which we have chosen for ourselves. Such an attitude of mind, complex in analysis but simple in itself, is the key to mastery or success in demonstration. There is no word for it in common parlance, because such a thing does not exist, except for those who are, in the more spiritual teaching of Jesus Christ. But if we wish to inherit the earth, we must absolutely acquire this meekness. Moses, who was extraordinarily successful in prayer, for he overcame the belief of beauty, to the point of manifesting the physical body, of a young man in the prime of life, when according to the calendar he was 120 years old, and then transcended matter completely, or dematerialized without dying, he was preeminently known for this quality. As meek as Moses, remember, apart from his own personal demonstration, he did a wonderful work for his whole nation, managing to bring it out of Egyptian slavery, in the face of incredible difficulties. For the success of the Exodus was the demonstration of Moses, and of a few advanced souls who helped him, influencing the whole subsequent course of history, by their teaching and deeds. Moses had an open mind, ready to be taught new things, and new ways of thinking and working. He did not reject the new revelation, because it was novel and revolutionary, as most of his self-satisfied colleagues in the Egyptian hierarchy would have done. At least at first, he was not free from serious character flaws, but he was big enough for intellectual or spiritual pride. And therefore, he gradually rose above these defects, as the new truth worked in his soul. Moses understood perfectly, that to conform rigorously to the will of God, far from involving the loss of any good, could only mean a life, finer and better. Therefore, he did not think of it as self-sacrifice, for he knew that it was the highest form of glorification, in the true and wonderful sense of the word. The self-glorification of the egoist is petty vanity, which leads ultimately to humiliation. On the contrary, true self-glorification, that which is truly glorious, is the glorification of God. The Father in me, he does the works, I in you, and you in me. Moses had a wonderful understanding of the power of the spoken word to call to good, which is scientific faith. He was one of the meekest men that ever lived, and none, save our Savior, has inherited the earth in a greater degree. There is a wonderful Oriental saying, which says, meekness compels God himself. Incidentally, blessed are they who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Righteousness is another of the great words of the Bible, one of those keys that the reader must have in his possession if he wants to understand this book. Like birth, meek, and comfort, it is a technical term used in a special and definite sense in the Bible. Righteousness means not only right conduct, but also right thinking in all matters, in every department of life. If we study the Sermon on the Mount, we shall find that every clause reiterates the great truth, that outward things are but the squeezed or pressed expression, or representation of our inner thoughts and beliefs. We have dominion or power over our thoughts, to think as we will, and thus, in this indirect way, we make or mar our lives, by the way we think. Jesus will tell us repeatedly in these discourses, that we have no direct power over external things, for these are but consequences, or if you will, resultant images, of what goes on in the secret place. If it were possible for us to affect external things directly, without changing our thought, it would mean that we could think one thing and produce another, and this would be contrary to the law of the universe. In fact, this very notion is the basic fallacy at the root of all human problems, all sickness and sin, all strife and poverty, and even death itself. Instead, the great law of the universe is just this: what you think in your mind, you will produce in your experience. As is the inside, so is the outside. You cannot think one thing and produce another. If you wish to control your circumstances, in order to achieve harmony and happiness, you must first control your thoughts, before you can achieve it. After that, external things will follow. If you want health, you must first think health. And remember, thinking of health does not simply mean thinking of a healthy body, important as it is, but also includes thinking of peace, contentment, and goodwill towards all. Because, as we shall see later, destructive emotion is one of the main causes of disease. If you want to develop spiritually, and grow in the knowledge of God, you must have spiritual thoughts, thoughts of God. As well as giving your attention, which is your life, to what is higher, instead of limitations. If you desire material prosperity, you must first cultivate thoughts of prosperity, until it becomes a habit. For what keeps most people in poverty is the sheer habit of thinking about poverty. If you desire good company, if you want to be loved, you must first have thoughts of love and goodwill. Good begets good is another way of stating the great law, which means that, as a man sows in his invisible thoughts, so shall he reap in what is seen. All things work for the good of those who love the good. To call good means to occupy oneself with thoughts of good. When people awaken to the knowledge of these great truths, they naturally try to begin to apply them in their own lives, realizing at last the vital importance of righteousness, or thinking in harmony. They, like sensible people, immediately begin to try to put their house in order. The principle in question is perfectly simple, but unfortunately, the realization of it is less easy, because it must be so. The answer lies in the extraordinary power of habit, and habits of thought are both the most subtle in character, and the most difficult to break. Comparatively, it is easy to break a physical habit, if one really wants to do so, because the action on the physical plane is much slower and more palpable than on the mental plane. In dealing with habits of thought, however, we cannot, as it were, stand back and take a comparatively distant view, as we can in contemplating our actions. Thought flows across the stage of consciousness in an unbroken stream, and so rapidly that only incessant vigilance can deal with it. Again, the theater of one's actions is the area of one's immediate presence. He can only act where I am. I can give orders by letter, by telephone, or push a button and get results at a distance, but still, my action occurs where I am, and in the present moment. By contrast, with thought, I can encompass the whole scope of my life, even all the people with whom I have been, or am related in some way. I can fly to the past or to the future, with the same ease. Therefore, we find that the task of achieving a harmonious thinking in every way, or true righteousness, is much greater than it seems at first glance. For this reason, many people get discouraged, and blame themselves for not having changed their way of thinking as soon as possible, destroy the old Adam, as Paul says. Obviously, this is a capital mistake, and incidentally, also self-condemnation. Being essentially negative thinking, and therefore, unfair, it has the tendency to produce even more problems, in the old vicious circle. If you are not progressing as fast as you wish, the remedy is to be even more careful, to keep only harmonious thoughts. Do not dwell on your mistakes, or on the slowness of your progress. If you do not claim God's presence with you, especially when this discouraging suggestion looms, claim wisdom, claim power or prosperity in prayer. Do a good mental balance or review of your life, and check that you no longer harbor negative thoughts. Somewhere in the back of your mind, is there a wrong course of action you are still following? Is there someone you have not yet forgiven? Are you indulging in some kind of political, racial or religious hatred or contempt? No doubt this is disguised under a cloak of self-righteousness. If so, take off the cloak, and get rid of that evil thing, for it is poison to you. Is there jealousy in your heart, whether personal or professional? This is a hateful thing, and much more common, than is admitted in polite society. If it is there, eliminate it at all costs. Is there any sentimental remorse? If so, reflect that as an immortal being, a child of God having spiritual dominion, no good thing is beyond your reach, here and now. Do not mourn for what is past and done, but make the present and the future a splendid realization of your heart's desire. Is there remorse for past mistakes? Remember that remorse, unlike repentance, is nothing more than a form of spiritual pride. Delighting in it, as some people do, is a betrayal of the love and forgiveness of God, who says, "Behold, and now the day of salvation, behold, I make all things new." In this beatitude, Jesus tells us not to be discouraged because we do not overcome everything at once, because our progress seems slow. However, if we do not progress at all, we may not be praying the right way, and we should find out why, by examining our lives and praying for wisdom and guidance. In fact, we should pray constantly for wisdom and guidance, and for the living action of the Spirit upon us, so that the quality of our prayers and our prosperity will steadily increase. But if we are getting on track, if things are improving, even if not very quickly, we need not be discouraged. We just have to keep working steadily, and as long as we are truly whole in our efforts, that is, we really hunger and thirst for righteousness. Then in the end, without a doubt, we will be satiated. It is impossible that a sincere search for truth and righteousness, if persevered in, will not be crowned with success. God does not mock, much less his children. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. This is a brief summary of the law of life, which Jesus develops in greater depth later, in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 7:1-5. In itself, the beatitude does not require much comment, because the words employed have the ordinary meaning, which we still give them in everyday life. The statement being as clear and obvious in its meaning as the law in question, it is simple and inflexible in its action. The point for the scientific Christian to bear in mind is that, as always, the vital importance of the principle dealt with in this beatitude lies in its application to the realm of thought. What really matters is that you be merciful in your thinking. Kind actions, coupled with unkind thoughts, are hypocrisy dictated by fear, desire for self-glory, or some such motive. They are counterfeits, and do not bless either the giver or the receiver. On the other hand, the true thought about the neighbor blesses him spiritually, mentally, and materially, and blesses you too. Let us have mercy in our mental judgments about our brother, because in truth, we are all one. And the more deeply he seems to err, the more urgent is the need to help him with right thinking, and thus facilitate his deliverance. You, because you understand the power of the spiritual idea, the Christ truth, have a responsibility that others do not have. Try not to evade it, since we are all one, we are all part of the living garment of God. You yourself will ultimately receive the same treatment that you give to others. You will receive the same merciful help, in your own hour of need, from those who are further along the path than you. But above all, it is certain that by freeing others from the burden of your condemnation, you make possible the absolution of their own condemnation. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. This is one of those wonderful gnomic sayings in which the Bible is so rich. In a few words, it sums up the whole philosophy of religion, as is usual in the scriptures. The words are used in a technical sense, and cover a much broader meaning than we give them in everyday life. Let us start from the basis. What is the promise of this beatitude? It is nothing less than seeing God. Of course, we know that God has no corporeal form, and therefore, it is not a matter of seeing him in the ordinary physical sense, in which one can see a human being or an object. If God could be seen in this way, he would have to be limited, and therefore, he would not be God. Seeing, as we understand it here, means spiritual perception, and spiritual perception is precisely the ability to understand the true nature of being, which we all lack. We dwell in the world of God, but we do not know it at all as it is. Heaven surrounds us, it is not a distant place in the heavens, it is all around us. But since we lack spiritual perception, we cannot recognize it, that is, we cannot experience it, and therefore, as far as we are concerned, it can be said that we are excluded from heaven. In reality, we get in touch with a very small fragment of it, and that same tiny fragment, we call it universe. But even that little piece we see, for the most part, all twisted. Heaven is the religious name for the presence of God, and heaven is infinite. But our mental habit leads us to mold our experience only in 3 dimensions. Heaven is eternity, and what we know here, we know only in series, in a sequence called time, which never allows us to understand an experience in its entirety. God is the divine mind, and in that mind there are no limitations, no restrictions at all. However, we see everything distributed in what is called space or spacing, which is an artificial restriction, which continually inhibits the constant regrouping of our experience, which requires our creative thinking. Heaven is the realm of the spirit of substance, without age or discord or decay, a realm of eternal good. And yet, to our distorted vision, everything is aging, decaying, wearing out, being born only to die, blooming only to fade away. It is as if a colorblind, he finds himself in a beautiful flower garden. All around him are glorious colors, but he ignores them, and sees only black, white and gray. And if we suppose that he is also devoid of the sense of smell, we will see that for him, there is only a very small part of the glory of the garden. However, although he cannot perceive it, everything is there. This limitation in us is known in theology as the fall of man, and arises from our use of free will in opposition to the will of God. God has created the upright man, but he always tends to become corrupt. Our task is to overcome these limitations as quickly as possible, until we reach the point where we can know things as they really are, experience heaven as it really is. That is the meaning of seeing God, and seeing him face to face. To see God is to learn the truth as it really is, and this is infinite freedom, and perfect bliss. By means of this wonderful beatitude, we are told exactly how to carry out this supreme task, and who are the ones who will do it. These are the pure in heart. Once again, it must be understood that the words pure and purity must be taken in a much broader sense than the one commonly assigned to them. Purity in the Bible implies much more than physical purity, that is, a vitally important thought, in its full and complete sense. Purity is to recognize God alone, as the only real cause, and the only real power in existence. In another part of the sermon, it is called the single eye, and it is the master key to life. It is but the secret of escape from all disease, trouble and limitation. The overcoming or reversal, in short, of the fall of man. Thus our text could well be paraphrased into something like this: Blessed are those who recognize God as the only real cause, the only real presence, and the only real power. Not in a theoretical or formal way, but practically and specifically, in all their thoughts and actions, and not just in some parts of their life. On the contrary, in every corner of it, without taking anything away from him, fulfilling his will to the last detail, overcoming every limitation of time, space and matter. Often, it is good for everyone to paraphrase in his own language the best known texts of Scripture, as this will help to clarify to his own mind the exact meaning given by the text. Sometimes, this will serve to draw attention to important meanings, which you had hitherto overlooked. Notice that Jesus speaks of the pure in heart. The word heart in the Bible usually means that part of man's mentality, which modern psychology, known under the name of subconscious mind. That is extremely important, because it is not enough that we accept the truth only with the conscious mind. At this point, it remains a mere opinion. It is not until it is accepted by the subconscious mind, and thus fully assimilated, that it can make any difference in one's character or in one's life. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it proceed the issues of life. Many persons, and especially learned persons, have all kinds of knowledge, which do not in the least affect or improve their practical life. Physicians know all about hygiene, but they often live in an unhealthy manner. Philosophers, who are familiar with the accumulated wisdom of the ages, and assent to most of it, go on doing foolish and stupid things in their own lives, and are unhappy and frustrated in consequence. Well, this kind of knowledge is no more than an opinion or head knowledge, as some call it. It must become heart knowledge, or be incorporated into the subconscious, before it can really change one. Modern psychologists, in their efforts to re-educate the subconscious, have the right idea, though they have not yet discovered the true method by which they can do it, which is scientific prayer, or the practice of the presence of God. Jesus, of course, thoroughly understood all this, and that is why he insists on the fact that we have to be pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. This is a priceless practical lesson on the art of prayer, which is the only means to return to communion with God. To the casual reader, this beatitude may appear to be a mere conventional religious generalization. Even a sententious platitude, of the kind too often used by people who are anxious to be edifying, without having anything in particular to say. In fact, prayer is the only real action, in the full sense of the word, because prayer is the only thing that changes character. A change of character or a change of soul is a real change. When that kind of change takes place, you become a different person. And therefore, for the rest of your life, you act in a different way than you have acted before and would have continued to act if you had not prayed. In other words, you become a different man. The degree of difference may be very slight every time you pray, but it is there, because you cannot pray without making yourself different to some degree. If you were to have a clear understanding of God's presence with you, it would make a very big and dramatic change in your character. So that in the blink of an eye, your outlook, your habits and your whole life would change completely, in every respect. Many such cases are recorded in the East as well as in the West. Authentic cases of what used to be called conversion are examples in this sense, since the change brought about by prayer is radical. Jesus refers to it as being born again. This makes you a different man, as if you were born again. The word prayer should be understood as any form of communion or attempt to communicate with God, both vocal and purely mental. It includes both affirmative prayer, as well as invocatory, each of which is good in its own sphere. From meditation, as well as the highest of all forms of prayer, which is contemplation. In the absence of prayer, the only thing you can do, is to express the character you have, in whatever circumstances you find yourself. And so much so, that most of your friends would be willing to predict in advance what your behavior would be in the various kinds of crises that might arise. By changing your character, prayer makes possible a new reaction. The great requirement for success is that we first attain some degree of true peace of mind. This true inner peace of soul was known to the mystics as serenity, and they never tire of telling us that serenity is the great passport to the presence of God. The sea, smooth as crystal, which surrounds the great white throne. This does not mean that even the most serious challenges cannot be overcome through prayer, even in the absence of serenity, since it is undoubtedly possible. In fact, the greater the problem in which one finds oneself, the less serenity one can have. And serenity itself can only be obtained through prayer, and through forgiveness of others, and of oneself. But serenity must be had before true spiritual progress can be made, and it is serenity, that fundamental tranquility of soul, to which Jesus refers by the word peace, the peace that surpasses all human understanding. Those who make peace, spoken of in this beatitude, are those who manifest it in their own souls. For it is they who overcome limitation, and become actually, and not merely potentially, children of God. Such a condition of mind is the aim at which Jesus aims, in all the instructions he gives us, in the Sermon on the Mount and elsewhere. Peace I give unto you, my peace I give unto you, let not your heart be troubled, nor let it be afraid. As long as there is fear or resentment, or any trouble in your heart, that is, as long as you lack serenity or peace, it is not possible for you to attain much. A certain degree of serenity is essential to achieve any true concentration. Of course, to be a peacemaker in the usual sense, to settle other people's disputes, is an excellent thing, but as all practical people know, it is an exceedingly difficult role to play. Interfering in other people's disputes makes it much easier to make things worse than to make them better. It is very likely that personal opinion will enter into your efforts, and it is very likely that personal opinion will be wrong. If you get the two people involved to adopt a new point of view on the matter in controversy, that, of course, is fine. But otherwise, if you merely achieve a compromise, in which they consent to agree for reasons of self-interest, or as a result of some kind of coercion, in that case, the problem has only been patched up on the surface, but there is no real peace, because you are not both satisfied and forgiven. When you understand the power of prayer, you can actually heal many quarrels in a real way, probably without talking at all. The silent idea of the omnipotent power of love and wisdom will make any problem dissolve almost imperceptibly. Consequently, any agreement, which will benefit all parties involved, will be formed under the influence of those words, expressed in silence. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they swear and persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you, with lies for my sake. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so persecuted they the prophets whom they despised. Considering what we know about the essential character of the teachings of Jesus, that God's will for us is harmony, peace and joy, and that all this is to be achieved by cultivating right thoughts or righteousness, this is a very surprising statement. Jesus tells us over and over again that our Father is pleased to give us the kingdom, and that the way we are to receive it is by cultivating serenity or peace of soul. He states that the peacemakers, who do this by praying with meekness, will obtain prosperity, will inherit the earth, their mourning will turn to joy. And that indeed, whatever they ask the Father according to this teaching, he will do it. But we are told here that it is blessed to be persecuted as a result of our right thinking or righteousness. For by this means we shall triumph, which is a cause for rejoicing and joy, to be reviled and accused, and that the prophets and the great enlightened ones also suffered these things. Certainly, all this is very surprising, and it is perfectly correct. Only we have to understand that the source of all this persecution is none other than ourselves. There is no external persecutor, but only our own lower self. When it is very difficult for us to be right, or to think correctly, when we feel very tempted to have wrong thoughts about a situation or a person, or about ourselves, to give way to fear, or anger or discouragement, then, we are being persecuted for the sake of righteousness. And for us, this is an extremely fortunate or blessed condition, because it is in those moments, when we are really moving forward. Any spiritual treatment or scientific prayer involves a struggle with our own lower self, which wants to indulge the old habit of thought. And in fact, it persecutes and injures us, if we want to say it dramatically, in the Oriental way. The great prophets and enlightened ones of the race, who finally conquered, did so precisely, by means of those struggles with themselves, when they were persecuted by their own lower natures, or the old Adam. Jesus himself, who was tempted in all things as we are, had to face this persecution more than once, especially in the Garden of Gethsemane, and for a few moments, on the cross itself. Well, as these battles with the lower self have to be fought sooner or later, the sooner they are over the better, and therefore, relatively, they are great blessings. Note well, that there is no virtue or advantage in being persecuted or bothered by other people. Nothing can come into our experience, unless it finds something in us, with which it is in tune. And so having problems and difficulties, is only a sign, that our own mentality needs to be clarified, for what you see at any time, is nothing more than your own concept. There is at this point a serious danger, for weak, vain or self-righteous people. Because others do not treat them as they would like to be treated, because they do not get the consideration they probably deserve. They often tend to argue that they are being persecuted because of their spiritual superiority, adopting absurd attitudes as a result. This is a pitiful fallacy, the result of the profound law of life, which is clearly stated in the Sermon on the Mount. We can only obtain that which belongs to us at any time, and no one can prevent us from obtaining it. Therefore, all persecution and hindrances come absolutely from within. Nevertheless, sentimental tradition holds us to it. There is no virtue in the martyrdom of not possessing. The martyr does not have a sufficient understanding of the truth, or it would be necessary for him to go through that experience. Jesus was not a martyr, for he could have been saved at any time, if he had wished to avoid crucifixion. It was necessary for someone to triumph over death, having actually died, but he deliberately chose for us, to do a certain work, and was not martyred. In no case should we despise the splendid courage, devotion and heroic self-denial, of the martyrs of all ages. But we must see that their understanding was incomplete, or they would not have been martyred. If you fix your attention on martyrdom, considering it as so many did, as the highest good, you will tend, as with anything you fix your attention on, to bring it to yourself. Although we may envy the moral and spiritual height they reached, we know that if the martyrs had sufficiently loved their enemies, and I say, love, in the scientific sense of knowing the truth about them, then, the Roman persecutors, even Nero himself, would have opened the prison doors to them, and the fanatic of the Inquisition would have come to reconsider their cause.
As we draw this audiobook journey to a close, may the wisdom and insights of Emmet Fox continue to resonate within your heart and mind. Remember, the secrets of metaphysics are not confined to the pages of a book, but are alive within the fabric of your being. Carry these teachings with you as you navigate life's journey, and may they serve as guiding lights illuminating your path. Farewell, dear listener, and may you continue to explore the boundless depths of existence with curiosity, courage, and an open heart.